The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of Kensington Palace, casting long shadows across the marble floors where Princess Charlotte played with her wooden blocks. At 7 years old, she possessed the kind of natural grace that seemed to run in royal bloodlines, her golden hair catching the light as she arranged her toys with the same precision her great-grandmother had once used to arrange state dinners. Catherine, the Princess of Wales, watched her daughter from the doorway, a gentle smile playing on her lips. These quiet moments had become precious to her, especially as the royal calendar grew increasingly demanding. The sound of approaching footsteps made her turn, and she saw William striding down the corridor, his expression unusually tense. "We need to talk," he said quietly, glancing toward Charlotte to ensure she couldn't hear. "It's about the guest list for the coronation anniversary celebration." Catherine's heart sank slightly. The anniversary of King Charles's coronation had been a source of ongoing tension within the family, with various factions having different opinions about how it should be commemorated. The event was meant to celebrate not just Charles's reign, but the continuity of the monarchy itself, making every decision about guest lists, protocols, and ceremonies particularly sensitive. "What's happened now?" Catherine asked, following William into his private study. The room was lined with leather-bound books and family photographs, creating an atmosphere that usually brought comfort, but today felt heavy with unspoken conflict. William closed the door carefully before turning to face his wife. "Camilla has taken it upon herself to review the guest list for the children's portion of the celebration. She's made several changes without consulting anyone. The children's portion had been Catherine's idea, a way to include the younger members of the royal family in a meaningful way while also showcasing the future of the monarchy. Charlotte, George, and Louis were all expected to participate, along with other young royals. It was meant to be a joyful addition to what could otherwise be a stuffy, formal affair." "What kind of changes?" Catherine asked, though she could already sense from William's tone that she wasn't going to like the answer. "She's removed Charlotte's name from the list of children who will be presented to the Archbishop," William said, his voice carefully controlled but clearly angry. "Apparently, she feels that only the direct heir and spare should be included in that particular ceremony." Catherine felt as though the air had been knocked out of her lungs. The presentation to the Archbishop was meant to be a blessing for the future generation, a moment that would be captured in official photographs and remembered in royal history. To exclude Charlotte felt not just like a slight against their daughter, but against Catherine herself. "On whose authority?" Catherine asked, her own voice beginning to show strain. "That's just it," William replied, running a hand through his hair in a gesture Catherine recognized as a sign of deep frustration. "She claims my father approved it, but when I spoke to him directly, he seemed surprised by the change. He said he thought it was something we had all agreed upon." The implications hung heavy in the air between them. Either Charles was being deliberately evasive, or Camilla was making decisions and presenting them as having royal approval when they didn't. Both possibilities were troubling for different reasons. Charlotte's laughter drifted in from the other room, a sound that seemed to emphasize the innocence at the center of this adult conflict. Catherine moved to the window, looking out at the gardens where tourists often gathered, hoping for a glimpse of royal life. They had no idea how complicated that life really was, how every decision was weighted with centuries of tradition and contemporary politics. "This isn't really about Charlotte," Catherine said quietly. "This is about Camilla establishing her position as queen consort, making sure everyone understands the hierarchy." William joined her at the window, his reflection visible in the glass beside hers. "I know, but Charlotte doesn't understand royal hierarchy. She just knows that her cousins will be included in something she won't be. How do we explain that to a 7-year-old?" It was a question that went to the heart of their struggle as parents within the royal system. They had always tried to give their children as normal a childhood as possible, while still preparing them for their future roles. But moments like this reminded them how difficult it was to protect their children from the complicated dynamics of royal life. "Have you spoken to your father directly about this?" Catherine asked. "I tried. He was diplomatic. You know how he gets when there's conflict between family members. He wants everyone to get along, but he's not always willing to make the hard decisions to ensure that happens. Catherine understood William's frustration. Charles had always been somewhat conflict-averse when it came to family matters, preferring to let others work things out rather than taking a firm stand. It was an approach that had served him well in some situations, but in others, it left room for more assertive personalities to fill the vacuum. What did he say exactly? Catherine pressed. He said that the final guest list hadn't been confirmed yet, and that all the details were still being worked out. But Camilla has already sent revised invitations to the Archbishop's office. It's essentially a done deal unless we make a formal objection. The word formal carried weight in royal circles. A formal objection would mean involving private secretaries, creating official records, and potentially escalating the conflict to a level that could damage relationships permanently. It wasn't a step to be taken lightly. And if we don't object? Catherine asked, though she already knew the answer. Then, Charlotte gets the message that her place in this family is conditional, subject to the whims of whoever has the king's ear at any given moment. They stood in silence for several minutes, both lost in thought. Outside, the changing of the guard was taking place, the ceremony proceeding with the same precision it had maintained for generations. There was something both comforting and oppressive about such continuity. "There's something else," William said finally. "I heard from one of the private secretaries that this isn't the only change Camilla has made. She's also adjusted the seating arrangements for the family dinner, moving several of our supporters to less prominent positions." Catherine turned to look at him directly. "Our supporters?" "People who have been vocal about supporting our vision for the future of the monarchy. Lady Sarah, for instance, has been moved from a main table to a side table. The Dean of Windsor, who officiated our wedding, has been removed from the blessing ceremony entirely." The pattern was becoming clear. This wasn't just about Charlotte. It was about systematically diminishing the influence of people associated with William and Catherine's branch of the family. It was the kind of subtle political maneuvering that could reshape power dynamics within the royal family without appearing openly confrontational. "She's very clever," Catherine said, not without a grudging respect for the strategy. "Making changes that seem reasonable on the surface, but collectively send a clear message about who's really in charge. The question is, what do we do about it?" William asked. Before Catherine could answer, there was a soft knock on the study door. "Mama, Papa." Charlotte's voice called from the other side. "Can I come in?" William and Catherine exchanged glances before William opened the door. Charlotte entered with the kind of confidence that came from being deeply loved, completely unaware of the conversation that had just taken place about her future. "I was wondering," Charlotte said, settling herself into one of the leather chairs with the unconscious grace of someone born to privilege, "if I could wear my blue dress to the big party next month. The one with the sparkles. The coronation anniversary celebration?" Catherine asked, her heart clenching at her daughter's innocent excitement. "Yes. George said there's going to be a special ceremony just for the children, and I want to look my best. Will there be lots of people watching?" William knelt down beside his daughter's chair, his expression gentle despite the turmoil of emotions he was clearly feeling. "There will be many people there, sweetheart. It's a very important day for our family. Will I get to meet the Archbishop again? He was so nice at Uncle Harry's wedding, even though Uncle Harry isn't around much anymore." The mention of Harry brought another layer of complexity to the situation. The ongoing rift with Harry and Meghan had already created tensions within the family about inclusion and exclusion. Now, with Charlotte potentially being excluded from the ceremony, Catherine couldn't help but see parallels. "We're still working out all the details for that day," Catherine said carefully. "But no matter what happens, you'll be there with us, and that's what matters most." Charlotte seemed satisfied with this answer, chattering on about her dress and whether Louis would behave himself during the ceremony. But after she left to continue her play, the weight of the situation settled back over William and Catherine. "We can't let this stand," William said quietly. "Not just for Charlotte's sake, but for what it represents. If we allow this kind of manipulation to succeed, it sets a precedent for the future. Catherine nodded, but she could also see the complexity of their position. Fighting too hard could create lasting damage to family relationships. But not fighting at all could establish a pattern of submission that would be difficult to break. "What do you propose?" she asked. "First, I think we need to understand exactly how these decisions were made and who was really involved. I want to speak to my father again, but this time with witnesses present. If Camilla is making unauthorized changes, we need to document that. And if she does have his authorization, then we need to understand why our 7-year-old daughter is being treated as a lesser member of this family. And we need to address that directly." The conversation was interrupted by Catherine's phone buzzing with a text message. She glanced at it and frowned. "It's from Sarah. She says there are already rumors circulating about changes to the anniversary celebration. The press office is getting inquiries." This added another dimension to their dilemma. Royal family conflicts that spilled into public view could damage the monarchy's reputation, something they both took seriously. But allowing internal manipulation to continue unchecked could be equally damaging in the long run. The press will turn this into a story about family feuds and power struggles, William said. "Camilla knows that. She's counting on our reluctance to create a public spectacle. So what's our move?" William was quiet for a long moment, clearly weighing their options. Finally, he spoke. "We document everything. We gather our facts. And then we have a conversation with my father that makes it clear this kind of behavior is unacceptable. If necessary, we're prepared to take it to the next level, which would be the Privy Council. If changes are being made to official royal ceremonies without proper authorization, they need to be involved. It was a nuclear option, one that would formalize the conflict and create lasting divisions within the family. But Catherine could see that William felt backed into a corner. As the future king, he couldn't allow his authority to be undermined so blatantly, especially when it came to his own children. "Let's hope it doesn't come to that," Catherine said. "So do I. But Camilla needs to understand that there are consequences for this kind of behavior. Our children's place in this family is not negotiable." As they stood together in the study, looking out at the gardens where Charlotte was now playing with her brothers, both William and Catherine felt the weight of responsibility that came with their positions. They were not just parents protecting their child. They were future monarchs setting precedents for how the royal family would operate for generations to come. The afternoon sun was beginning to fade, casting longer shadows across the palace grounds. In a few hours, they would need to put on their public faces, attend scheduled events, and pretend that all was well within the royal family. But privately, they both knew that a battle was beginning, one that would test not just their resolve, but their vision for what the monarchy should become. The sound of Charlotte's laughter echoed through the corridors, a reminder of what was at stake in this conflict that extended far beyond guest lists and ceremony protocols. It was about the future of the royal family itself, and whether love and fairness would ultimately triumph over political maneuvering and power plays. As evening approached, William and Catherine began to prepare for what they both knew would be a difficult conversation with King Charles. The stakes could not be higher, and the outcome would shape their family's dynamics for years to come. The private dining room at Clarence House felt unusually tense as William and Catherine arrived for what had been scheduled as a routine family dinner. King Charles greeted them with his characteristic warmth, but Catherine noticed a certain wariness in his eyes that suggested he anticipated the conversation they were about to have. Camilla entered the room moments later, impeccably dressed and carrying herself with the confidence that had become her trademark since becoming queen consort. Her smile was pleasant, but didn't quite reach her eyes as she acknowledged William and Catherine's presence. "How lovely to see you both," she said, her voice carrying the precise tone that had been perfected through years of royal training. "I trust the children are well." "They're very excited about the anniversary celebration," Catherine replied, her own tone carefully neutral. "Charlotte especially is looking forward to participating in the children's ceremony." There was the briefest flicker of something across Camilla's face before she smoothly responded, "Yes, well, we're still finalizing all the details for that portion of the event." Charles, seemingly oblivious to the undercurrent of tension, began discussing the weather and recent engagements, but William was clearly not in the mood for small talk. As they took their seats for dinner, he addressed the elephant in the room directly. "Father, we need to clarify something about the anniversary celebration. There seems to be some confusion about Charlotte's involvement in the ceremony." Charles set down his wine glass and looked between his son and daughter-in-law, then at Camilla. "What sort of confusion?" "I was told that Charlotte's name had been removed from the list for the Archbishop's blessing, and that this was done with your approval," William continued, his voice carefully controlled but firm. "I don't recall approving any specific removals," Charles said slowly, glancing at Camilla. "I thought we had agreed that the ceremony would include all the grandchildren of appropriate age." Camilla delicately dabbed her lips with her napkin before responding. "Charles, darling, we discussed this last week. You agreed that the ceremony should focus on the direct line of succession to avoid confusion about precedence. It's really about maintaining proper protocol." Catherine felt her jaw tighten at the casual way Camilla spoke, as if the exclusion of Charlotte was merely a matter of administrative efficiency rather than a decision that would deeply hurt a young child. "I don't remember that conversation," Charles said, his brow furrowing in concentration. "When exactly did we discuss this?" "It was Tuesday evening, after your meeting with the Archbishop about the ceremony details. You said you wanted everything to be clear and unambiguous for the historical record." William and Catherine exchanged glances. They both recognized the tactic being employed, referencing a private conversation that only Camilla could verify, presenting it as settled fact when it was likely never discussed at all, or at least not in the way she was describing. "Father," William said carefully, "if you did approve this change, I need to understand the reasoning. Charlotte is your granddaughter, and she's old enough to participate meaningfully in the ceremony. What message does her exclusion send about her place in the family?" Charles looked genuinely troubled by the question. "I certainly never intended to send any negative messages about Charlotte's place in the family. She's a delightful child and a beloved granddaughter." "Then perhaps we should reconsider this decision," Catherine suggested gently. "The ceremony was originally planned to showcase the next generation of royals. Charlotte represents that future just as much as George and Louis." Camilla's expression remained pleasant, but there was steel in her voice when she spoke. "Of course Charlotte is beloved, but we must also consider practical matters. The ceremony needs to be manageable, and there are questions of precedence that must be observed. We can't simply ignore centuries of protocol because it feels more inclusive." "What precedence exactly?" William asked, his voice taking on an edge. "Charlotte is the daughter of the future king. Her position in the family is clear. But she's not in the direct line of succession," Camilla replied smoothly. "The ceremony is meant to emphasize continuity of the crown, which flows through the male line in this generation." Catherine felt a flash of anger at this blatant disregard for the recent changes to succession laws, which had eliminated male primogeniture. But before she could speak, William responded with barely contained fury. "That's completely inaccurate. The succession laws were changed over a decade ago. Gender is no longer a factor in determining place in line to the throne. Charlotte has exactly the same status as Louis in terms of royal precedence." Charles looked between his family members with growing discomfort. "Perhaps we should all take a step back. This is meant to be a celebration, not a source of family discord." "With respect, Father," William continued, "this isn't about discord. This is about ensuring that our children are treated fairly and that decisions affecting them are made transparently with input from their parents." Camilla set down her fork with deliberate precision. "William, I understand your concern for your daughter, but you must also understand that there are larger considerations at play. The anniversary celebration is not just about our immediate family. It's about the institution of the monarchy. Every decision sends a message to the public and to the Commonwealth about our values and priorities. Exactly, Catherine interjected. And what message does it send when we exclude a 7-year-old girl from a ceremony meant to celebrate the future of the monarchy? Especially when that exclusion is based on outdated interpretations of succession laws. The room fell silent, except for the ticking of an antique clock on the mantelpiece. Charles appeared to be wrestling with the competing arguments, while Camilla maintained her composed facade despite the clear challenge to her authority. "I think," Charles said finally, "that we may need to involve the private secretaries in this discussion. If there are questions about protocol and precedents, they should provide guidance based on current laws and precedents." It was a diplomatic response, but William recognized it as a partial victory. By suggesting official consultation, Charles was acknowledging that the decision couldn't simply be made unilaterally by Camilla. "I agree completely," William said. "I think it would be helpful to have clear, official guidance about how these ceremonies should be structured and what factors should be considered when making decisions about family participation." Camilla's smile became slightly strained. "Of course, if that's what you feel is necessary. Though I do hope we're not going to bureaucratize every family celebration." "This isn't about bureaucracy," Catherine said firmly. "This is about making sure that decisions affecting our children are made fairly and transparently. Charlotte didn't ask to be born into this family, but now that she's here, she deserves to be treated with the same consideration as any other grandchild." The mention of Charlotte seemed to soften Charles's expression. "You're absolutely right, Catherine. Charlotte is a wonderful girl, and I would never want her to feel excluded or less valued than her brothers." "Then perhaps you could speak to the Archbishop's office directly," William suggested. "Clarify that the original plan should stand unless there are compelling reasons to change it, and that any such reasons should be discussed with all relevant family members." Charles nodded slowly. "Yes, I think that would be appropriate. I'll call Archbishop Williams tomorrow morning and ensure we have a clear understanding of the ceremony structure." Camilla's fork clinked against her plate slightly harder than necessary. "Of course, Charles. Whatever you think is best." But her tone suggested that this was far from over. Catherine could see the wheels turning behind Camilla's carefully controlled expression, already calculating her next move in what was clearly becoming a more sustained power struggle. The rest of the dinner passed with forced normalcy, but the underlying tension never fully dissipated. Conversation moved to safer topics: upcoming state visits, charity engagements, the children's school activities, but everyone at the table was aware of the unresolved conflict simmering beneath the surface. As they prepared to leave, Charles pulled William aside for a private word. "Son, I want you to know that I never intended for Charlotte to be excluded from anything. If I gave that impression, it was a misunderstanding. I believe you, Father. But I need you to understand how concerning it is when major decisions about family events are made without consulting the parents involved. This affects how our children see their place in the family." Charles looked genuinely pained by this observation. "You're right, of course. I've been so focused on trying to keep everyone happy that I may not have been paying enough attention to the details of how decisions were being made." "It's not about keeping everyone happy," William said gently but firmly. "It's about being fair and transparent. Camilla is your wife, and we respect that. But she's also not Charlotte's grandmother, and decisions about Charlotte's participation in family events should involve Catherine and me." The drive back to Kensington Palace was quiet. Both William and Catherine lost in thought about the evening's conversation. Finally, Catherine spoke. "Do you think he really didn't remember approving the change?" William considered the question carefully. "I think he probably had a conversation with Camilla about the ceremony, and she presented her preferences in a way that made them sound like reasonable suggestions rather than unilateral decisions. He may have nodded along without fully understanding what he was agreeing to. And now I think he realizes that this has become a bigger issue than he anticipated, and he's trying to find a way to resolve it without explicitly admitting that Camilla overstepped her authority." They pulled into the palace grounds, where the familiar sight of their home provided some comfort after the tense evening. But both knew that this was likely just the beginning of a longer struggle over authority and influence within the royal family. The next morning brought unexpected developments. William received a call from his father's private secretary, informing him that there had been some administrative confusion regarding the anniversary ceremony, and that the Archbishop's office would be reverting to the original plan that included all eligible grandchildren. It was a victory, but a qualified one. Charlotte would be included in the ceremony, but the underlying issues that had created the conflict remained unresolved. Camilla had been forced to retreat on this particular issue, but her motivations and methods hadn't changed. Catherine found William in his study later that morning, staring out the window at the gardens where Charlotte was playing with her governess. His expression was thoughtful, but troubled. "Penny for your thoughts," Catherine said, settling into the chair beside his desk. "I'm wondering if this is just the beginning," William replied. "If Camilla is willing to manipulate situations like this when it comes to Charlotte, what else might she try to influence? School choices? Future royal roles? Marriage prospects?" It was a sobering thought. Charlotte was only 7 years old, but in royal families, long-term planning often began early. If power struggles were already emerging around relatively minor ceremonial roles, they could become much more intense as Charlotte grew older and her future position became more significant. "We'll face those challenges when they come," Catherine said. "For now, we've established that decisions about our children need to go through us. That's an important precedent." William nodded, but his expression remained concerned. "I just worry about what this is doing to the family dynamics. Charlotte, George, and Louis shouldn't have to grow up navigating adult power struggles every time there's a family event. They won't, as long as we stay vigilant and stand up for them when necessary. What we showed last night is that we won't allow them to be used as pawns in other people's games." Outside, Charlotte's laughter echoed across the courtyard as she chased her governess in an impromptu game of tag. The sound was a reminder of what they were fighting to protect. Not just their daughter's position in ceremonial events, but her right to a childhood free from unnecessary adult conflicts. The phone on William's desk buzzed with a text message. He glanced at it, and his expression darkened slightly. "What is it?" Catherine asked. "It's from the press office. They're getting inquiries about rumors of disagreements regarding the anniversary celebration planning. Someone has been talking to reporters." Catherine felt a chill of apprehension. Royal family conflicts that spilled into the media could quickly spiral out of control, damaging not just individual relationships, but the monarchy's public image. "Do we know where the leak came from?" she asked. "Not yet, but I have my suspicions. This kind of strategic media placement has Camilla's fingerprints all over it." The implications were serious. If Camilla was willing to involve the press in family disputes, it suggested a level of escalation that could make private resolution much more difficult. Once stories were in the media, positions became hardened and compromise became more challenging. "What's our response?" Catherine asked. "For now, we say nothing publicly. But privately, we need to make it very clear to everyone involved that using the media to fight family battles is unacceptable and will have consequences." As the morning progressed, it became clear that the previous evening's dinner had marked a turning point in the royal family dynamics. Lines had been drawn, positions had been established, and the battle for influence over the next generation had officially begun. Charlotte continued to play in the garden, blissfully unaware that her name had become the center of a struggle that would ultimately determine how the royal family would operate for years to come. But William and Catherine both understood that protecting their children's interests would require constant vigilance and occasional confrontation. The phone rang again, and William answered with a weary tone. It was clear that this crisis was far from over, and that the real test of their resolve was yet to come. The media storm that followed was unlike anything the royal family had experienced in years. What had started as whispered rumors about guest list changes had exploded into front-page headlines about palace power struggles and the new queen's iron fist. William stood in his private office at Kensington Palace, scanning the morning newspapers spread across his desk, each one more sensationalized than the last. Camilla cuts Charlotte screamed the headline of one tabloid, while a more respectable broadsheet opted for questions raised about royal protocol changes. But, regardless of the publication's reputation, the story was essentially the same. There was conflict within the royal family, and 7-year-old Princess Charlotte had become an unwilling symbol of that discord. Catherine entered the office carrying 2 cups of coffee, her face drawn with exhaustion. Neither of them had slept well, knowing that their private family matter had become public entertainment. "Any word from the press office about how this leaked?" she asked, setting 1 cup beside William. "Not officially, but Jeremy thinks he's traced at least one source to someone with connections to Clarence House," William replied, referring to his communications secretary. "The details that made it into the papers are too specific to have come from anywhere else." The implications were staggering. If someone close to Camilla was deliberately feeding information to the media, it suggested a coordinated campaign rather than a simple family disagreement. It meant that their private conversations were being weaponized for public consumption. "What's our response strategy?" Catherine asked, though she dreaded the answer. She had always preferred to handle family matters privately, but that option seemed to be slipping away. "The palace will issue a brief statement saying that planning for the anniversary celebration is ongoing and that all details will be announced in due course. We won't address the specific allegations, but we also won't allow false narratives to go unchallenged indefinitely." It was a careful balance, dignified enough to maintain royal standards, but firm enough to signal that they wouldn't be passive victims of a media campaign. But Catherine could see the strain this was putting on William, who had always tried to keep his family out of negative publicity. The situation became more complicated when Charlotte herself brought up the newspaper stories. She had overheard conversations between staff members and, with the natural curiosity of a bright 7-year-old, had asked her governess about why people were writing about her in the papers. "Mama," Charlotte said that afternoon as Catherine helped her with her homework, "Miss Sarah said there are stories about me in the newspapers. Am I in trouble?" Catherine's heart broke at the innocence of the question. Charlotte had no understanding of adult power dynamics or media manipulation. She only knew that her name was being discussed in contexts that seemed serious and potentially negative. "No, sweetheart, you're not in trouble at all," Catherine said gently, setting aside the math worksheet they had been working on. "Sometimes grown-ups disagree about things, and, unfortunately, those disagreements sometimes get written about in newspapers. But none of it is your fault, and you haven't done anything wrong." "Is it about the big party?" Charlotte asked. "George said there was some confusion about whether I would get to participate." Catherine felt a surge of anger that Charlotte was even aware of the controversy. She and William had worked so hard to shield their children from the more unpleasant aspects of royal life, but now outside forces were making that impossible. "There is some confusion, but it's been sorted out now," Catherine said. "You will absolutely be participating in the celebration, and you'll look beautiful in your sparkly blue dress." Charlotte seemed satisfied with this explanation, but Catherine knew that this was likely just the beginning. As the children grew older and became more aware of public attention, protecting them from family conflicts would become increasingly difficult. The afternoon brought an unexpected visitor to Kensington Palace. Lady Sarah Chatto, Princess Margaret's daughter and one of the Queen's beloved nieces, arrived unannounced with a grim expression and a folder full of newspaper clippings. "We need to talk," she said without preamble as William ushered her into his study. Sarah had always been known for her directness, a trait that had sometimes gotten her into trouble, but had also earned her respect within the family. "I assume this is about the media coverage," William said, gesturing for her to take a seat. "It's about more than that," Sarah replied, opening her folder. "I've been keeping track of the stories, and there's a pattern here that goes beyond simple gossip reporting. Someone is orchestrating this coverage, and they're doing it very skillfully." She spread several newspaper articles across William's desk, pointing out specific details as she spoke. "Look at the timeline. The first story appeared in the Daily Mail exactly 12 hours after your dinner at Clarence House. The information is too accurate and too detailed to have come from casual observation. Catherine leaned forward to examine the articles more closely. Sarah was right. The coverage contained specifics about guest list changes, ceremony protocols, and even quotes that were close enough to actual conversation to be disturbing. But more concerning, Sarah continued, is how the narrative is being shaped. Look at how Charlotte is being portrayed versus how the decision-making process is being described. The stories consistently paint Camilla as making reasonable, protocol-driven decisions, while implying that you too are being overprotective or demanding special treatment for your daughter. William felt his jaw tighten as he recognized the subtle but effective character assassination taking place in the media. By framing the conflict as protective parents versus institutional protocol, the coverage made William and Catherine appear unreasonable while positioning Camilla as a defender of royal tradition. "There's something else," Sarah said, her voice dropping. "I've been contacted by 2 different journalists in the past 24 hours, both asking for my perspective on the changing dynamics within the royal family, and specifically whether I thought younger royals were receiving appropriate guidance from senior family members." The implication was clear. The media campaign wasn't limited to the immediate conflict over Charlotte's participation in the ceremony. It was part of a broader effort to shape public perception of the family hierarchy and to position Camilla as the mature, experienced voice of reason against what could be painted as youthful ambition or entitlement. "What did you tell them?" Catherine asked. "Nothing, of course. But the fact that they approached me suggests this is being orchestrated at a very high level. They knew exactly which family members to target for quotes that might support their narrative." William stood and walked to the window, looking out at the garden where his children played, oblivious to the media storm swirling around them. "So what do you think we should do?" "Fight back," Sarah said without hesitation, "but carefully and strategically. Right now, they control the narrative because they're the only ones actively managing the story. You need to start shaping public perception yourselves, but in a way that doesn't appear obviously defensive." It was a sobering assessment. William had always preferred to stay above media battles, believing that royal dignity required a certain distance from press manipulation. But Sarah's analysis suggested that remaining passive would only allow damaging narratives to solidify. "What would that look like practically?" Catherine asked. "Well-placed interviews with sympathetic journalists. Carefully orchestrated public appearances that subtly reinforce your message. Perhaps most importantly, you need allies within the family who are willing to speak up publicly about the importance of fairness and inclusion." The conversation was interrupted by William's private secretary, who entered with an urgent expression. "Sir, I'm sorry to interrupt, but we've just received word that Her Majesty would like to see you and the Princess of Wales at Windsor this evening. She specifically mentioned that the meeting should be private." William and Catherine exchanged glances. The Queen's involvement could either help resolve the situation or escalate it significantly, depending on her perspective and approach. "Did she give any indication of what she wants to discuss?" William asked. "Only that she's concerned about recent media coverage and its impact on the family's reputation." After the secretary left, Sarah gathered her newspaper clippings and prepared to go. "Whatever happens at Windsor, remember that this isn't just about Charlotte or even about this particular ceremony. This is about establishing precedents for how the family will operate in the future. The decisions you make now will affect how your children are treated for the rest of their lives." The drive to Windsor Castle that evening was tense, with both William and Catherine unsure what to expect from the Queen's intervention. The monarch had always been careful about family disputes, preferring to let conflicts resolve themselves rather than taking sides. But the public nature of this controversy had apparently forced her hand. Queen Elizabeth received them in her private sitting room, a space that had hosted countless family conversations over the decades. At 97, she remained sharp and observant, though the weight of recent years was visible in her manner. "Sit down, both of you," she said without preamble. We need to discuss this unfortunate situation that has developed around the anniversary celebration. William began to explain their perspective on the guest list changes, but the Queen held up a hand to stop him. I'm not interested in relitigating the specific details, she said firmly. What concerns me is how this private family matter has become public entertainment, and, more importantly, how it's affecting the reputation of the monarchy as an institution. The rebuke was gentle, but unmistakable. The Queen was making it clear that, from her perspective, the manner in which the conflict had been handled was as problematic as the conflict itself. Ma'am, Catherine said carefully, we've tried to handle this matter privately. We never wanted it to become public. I understand that, Catherine, but intention and result are not always the same thing. The fact remains that we now have a situation where newspaper readers are speculating about power struggles within our family, and that serves no one's interests. The Queen paused to pour tea, a ritual that often preceded her most serious conversations. I've spoken with Charles about this matter, and I've also had conversations with Camilla. It seems that there were genuine misunderstandings about decision-making processes and communication protocols. William leaned forward slightly. What kind of misunderstandings, ma'am? The kind that occur when people make assumptions about authority and consultation without clearly establishing how decisions should be made, the Queen replied diplomatically. Charles believed he was agreeing to general principles, while Camilla believed she was receiving specific authorization. You believed you should have been consulted, while others assumed you had already been informed. It was a masterful summary that managed to acknowledge everyone's perspective without assigning blame to any particular party. But it also suggested that the Queen saw this as a systemic problem rather than intentional manipulation. Moving forward, the Queen continued, I'm implementing new protocols for family events and ceremonies. All major decisions will be documented in writing, with clear records of who was consulted and who gave authorization. No changes will be made without input from affected family members, particularly when children are involved. It was exactly what William and Catherine had hoped for, but the Queen wasn't finished. However, she said, fixing them both with a steady gaze, I also expect that future disagreements will be handled with more discretion. The monarchy's strength depends on public confidence in our unity and stability. We cannot afford to have family disputes played out in the media, regardless of who initiates such coverage. The message was clear. They had won this particular battle, but future conflicts would need to be managed more carefully. The Queen was establishing new safeguards, but she was also warning them about the consequences of allowing private matters to become public spectacles. As they prepared to leave Windsor, the Queen asked to speak with William privately. Catherine waited in the corridor while grandmother and grandson had their final conversation. William, the Queen said when they were alone, I want you to understand that I recognize the difficult position you're in. Protecting your children while maintaining family harmony is never easy. But you must also understand that every action you take as future king sends a message about how the monarchy will operate. William nodded, understanding the deeper implications of her words. The decisions you make now about how to handle conflict and exercise authority will establish patterns that will follow you throughout your reign. Choose carefully. The drive back to London was quiet, both William and Catherine processing the evening's conversation. They had achieved their immediate goal. Charlotte would participate fully in the anniversary celebration, and new protocols would prevent similar conflicts in the future. But they had also received a clear warning about the need for better conflict management. Do you think this is over? Catherine asked as they neared Kensington Palace. The immediate crisis, yes, William replied. But the underlying tensions? Those will probably continue in different forms. We've established some boundaries, but we haven't changed the personalities or motivations involved. As they pulled into the palace grounds, they could see lights still on in the children's quarters. Charlotte, George, and Louis would be getting ready for bed, their evening routines blissfully unaffected by the day's developments. At least Charlotte will get to wear her sparkly dress, Catherine said with a small smile. And Hopefully, William replied. She'll never fully understand what it took to make that happen. The next morning brought news that the media coverage was already beginning to shift. Royal correspondents were reporting on the Queen's new protocols for family event planning, framing it as a positive step toward greater transparency and consultation. The narrative was evolving from family conflict to institutional improvement. But privately, William and Catherine both understood that this was likely just the end of the first chapter in a longer story. The battle over Charlotte's place in the anniversary ceremony had been won, but the war over influence and authority within the royal family was far from over. The real test would come in the months and years ahead, as they continued to navigate the complex dynamics of a family where personal relationships were always intertwined with institutional power, and where every decision carried consequences that extended far beyond immediate circumstances. 3 months had passed since the anniversary celebration, and on the surface, it appeared that the royal family had weathered the storm successfully. Charlotte had indeed worn her sparkly blue dress and participated beautifully in the ceremony, her presence adding exactly the kind of youthful energy that had originally been envisioned. The photographs from that day showed a united family celebrating together, giving no hint of the behind-the-scenes drama that had preceded the event. But for those who knew how to read the signs, the underlying tensions were far from resolved. William sat in his study on a crisp October morning, reviewing correspondence that had arrived overnight, when his private secretary knocked with an expression that had become all too familiar in recent months. "Sir, we have a situation developing," Jeremy said, closing the door behind him. "It's regarding the Christmas arrangements at Sandringham." William set down his pen with a sigh. "What now?" "Her Majesty the Queen Consort has submitted a proposed schedule for the Christmas period that includes some significant changes to traditional arrangements. She's characterized them as modernization efforts that will make the celebrations more efficient and meaningful." The careful phrasing told William everything he needed to know. Once again, Camilla was making unilateral decisions and presenting them as reasonable improvements rather than power grabs. But this time, she had chosen to target one of the most sacred traditions in the royal calendar. "What kind of changes?" William asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer would be troubling. Jeremy consulted his notes. "The most significant change affects the children's Christmas Eve service. Traditionally, all grandchildren participate in the family service at St. Mary Magdalene. The new proposal suggests that only children who are actively preparing for future royal roles should be included, with others joining the family for private prayers instead." William felt the familiar surge of anger that had become his automatic response to these coded exclusions. The phrasing was deliberately vague, but the intention was clear. Charlotte would once again be treated as a lesser member of the family, excluded from public ceremonial roles that had been intended to include all the Queen's great-grandchildren. "Has my father approved this?" William asked, though he suspected the answer would be the same diplomatic ambiguity they had encountered before. His Majesty apparently agreed to review the Christmas arrangements with an eye toward making them more meaningful for the children involved, but there's no record of him specifically approving these particular changes. It was the same pattern they had seen before. Charles giving general approval to the concept of improvements, while Camilla interpreted that as authorization for specific changes that served her agenda. The new protocols established by the Queen should have prevented this, but Camilla had found a way to work around them by framing her decisions as beneficial suggestions rather than formal policy changes. Catherine entered the study as Jeremy was leaving, immediately sensing the tension in the room. "Please tell me this isn't what I think it is," she said, noting William's expression. "Christmas arrangements," William replied grimly. "Charlotte is being excluded from the traditional Christmas Eve service, ostensibly to streamline the ceremony." Catherine sank into the chair across from William's desk. How was she managing to keep doing this? The Queen specifically said that all major decisions needed to go through proper consultation. She's being very clever about it. She's not making major decisions. She's making helpful suggestions for improving existing traditions. By the time anyone realizes what's really happening, the changes are already in motion, and opposing them makes us look like we're the ones being disruptive. It was a masterful strategy that exploited the royal family's preference for avoiding direct confrontation. By couching her power plays in language of improvement and efficiency, Camilla made it difficult to challenge her without appearing to oppose progress or family harmony. "What's our response?" Catherine asked. Before William could answer, his phone buzzed with a text message that made his expression darken further. "It's from Harry," he said, showing Catherine the screen. "He wants to know if we're planning to do anything about the Christmas situation before it affects his children too." The message was brief and carefully worded, but it carried significant implications. Harry and Meghan had maintained their distance from most royal activities since stepping back from their senior roles, but they still brought their children to certain family celebrations. If Harry was concerned enough to reach out, it suggested that the exclusionary pattern was broader than just Charlotte. "What do you think he knows?" Catherine asked. "Probably more than we do," William replied. "Harry may have his issues with the family, but he still has contacts within the royal household. If he's hearing rumors about Christmas arrangements, it means the staff are talking." The phone rang before they could discuss the situation further. William answered to find his father on the line, sounding more agitated than usual. "William, I need to see you and Catherine this afternoon. There's been a development regarding the Christmas planning that requires immediate attention." The urgency in Charles's voice was unusual. Typically, family meetings were scheduled well in advance through private secretaries, with formal agendas and careful preparation. Emergency requests suggested something had gone seriously wrong. "Of course, Father. What's happened? I'd rather discuss it in person. Can you be at Highgrove by 3 o'clock? The drive to Highgrove House took William and Catherine through countryside that was beginning to show the colors of autumn. Under normal circumstances, it would have been a pleasant journey to one of Charles's favorite residences, where he often retreated when he needed to think through complex problems. But today, the scenic route felt ominous rather than peaceful. They arrived to find Charles waiting in his garden room, surrounded by papers and looking more stressed than they had seen him in years. Camilla was notably absent, which immediately told them that this conversation was about her rather than with her. "Sit down, both of you," Charles said without his usual pleasantries. "We have a serious problem, and I need your help to resolve it before it damages the family irreparably." William and Catherine exchanged glances, both wondering what could have prompted such an urgent and dramatic summons. "I've discovered that the Christmas arrangement proposals were not the only changes Camilla has been making to family traditions," Charles continued. "She's also been communicating directly with staff members about future event planning, essentially bypassing the protocols that my mother established after the anniversary celebration controversy." This was more serious than they had realized. If Camilla was working around the Queen's explicitly established procedures, it suggested a level of insubordination that could have far-reaching consequences for royal household operations. "What kind of communications?" Catherine asked. "Instructions about guest lists for state dinners, seating arrangements for family events, even suggestions about which charities should receive royal patronage. She's been presenting these as guidance from the king's household, but I never authorized any of them." William felt a chill of realization. If Camilla was essentially operating a shadow royal household, making decisions and issuing instructions without proper authorization, it could create chaos throughout the entire royal system. Staff members wouldn't know which instructions to follow, and conflicting directives could undermine the efficiency that was crucial to royal operations. "How did you find out?" William asked. "The Queen's private secretary contacted me directly. Apparently, some of Camilla's instructions contradicted existing arrangements that had already been approved by my mother, and the staff didn't know how to proceed. When they tried to clarify the situation, they discovered that many of the royal directives they had been receiving weren't actually authorized by anyone. The implications were staggering. The royal household operated on a complex system of established protocols and clear authority chains. If those systems were being undermined by unauthorized communications, it could destabilize the entire operation. What's been the Queen's response? Catherine asked. Charles looked genuinely pained by the question. She's extremely concerned both about the operational confusion and about what this means for family relationships. She's asked me to resolve the situation immediately and ensure that it doesn't happen again. It was essentially an ultimatum from the Queen. Fix the problem with Camilla's behavior or face more serious consequences. Given the Queen's age and the importance of maintaining stability during the transition period, her patience with family drama was clearly at an end. "What do you need from us?" William asked, though he suspected the answer would be complicated. "I need you to support me in establishing clear boundaries about decision-making authority, even if that creates temporary friction with Camilla. I also need your help in communicating to the household staff that all future directives must go through proper channels." It was a significant request, essentially asking William and Catherine to side with him in a direct confrontation with Camilla. But it was also an acknowledgement that Charles finally understood the scope of the problem and was willing to address it directly. "Of course we'll support you," Catherine said. "But what happens after we establish these boundaries? Do you think Camilla will accept them?" Charles was quiet for a long moment, staring out at his beloved gardens as if they might provide the answer to an impossible question. "I honestly don't know," he said finally. "I think she sees herself as helping to modernize and improve royal operations. But I also think she may have lost sight of the difference between making suggestions and making decisions. And if she continues to resist these boundaries," William pressed, "then we'll have to consider more serious measures," Charles replied, his voice heavy with reluctance. "The monarchy cannot function if there are multiple competing sources of authority within the royal household." The conversation continued for another hour, with Charles outlining the specific steps he wanted to take to clarify authority structures and ensure proper consultation on all family matters. By the time William and Catherine left Highgrove, they had agreed to a comprehensive plan that would essentially reset the power dynamics within the royal family. But they both understood that implementing the plan would likely trigger the most serious family crisis they had yet faced. Camilla had invested considerable effort in establishing her influence over royal operations, and she was unlikely to give up that influence without a fight. The drive back to London was subdued, both of them processing the implications of what they had just agreed to support. "Do you think this will actually resolve anything?" Catherine asked as they neared Kensington Palace. "I think it will force a resolution one way or another," William replied. "Either Camilla will accept the new boundaries and learn to work within them, or she'll escalate the conflict to a point where more dramatic action becomes necessary. And Charlotte will finally be able to participate in family traditions without having to worry about arbitrary exclusions based on someone else's power games. That alone makes this worth doing." As they pulled into the palace grounds, they could see lights on in the children's quarters, where Charlotte, George, and Louis were probably finishing their homework or enjoying their evening playtime. The sight reminded them both of what was really at stake in these adult conflicts: the right of their children to grow up feeling fully included in their own family. The phone in William's study was ringing as they entered the palace, and he answered to find the Queen's private secretary on the line with a message that would change everything. "Sir, Her Majesty has asked me to inform you that she will be making an announcement tomorrow regarding new protocols for royal household operations. She wanted you and the Princess of Wales to know in advance that these protocols will formalize many of the arrangements you've been discussing." It was the Queen's way of ensuring that the changes would have her full authority behind them, making them impossible for anyone to ignore or work around. The battle lines were finally being drawn clearly, with institutional support firmly behind the principles of proper consultation and transparent decision-making. "Thank you for letting us know," William said. "Please convey to Her Majesty our full support for these new protocols." After hanging up, William found Catherine in Charlotte's room, helping their daughter choose a book for bedtime reading. Charlotte was debating between two options, completely absorbed in the important decision of which story she wanted to hear. "I think I'll choose the one about the princess who has adventures," Charlotte announced, holding up a book with a colorful cover. "She gets to do exciting things, and everyone treats her fairly." William and Catherine exchanged a look over their daughter's head, both thinking the same thing. If their efforts succeeded, Charlotte might indeed grow up in a royal family, where she would be treated fairly and have the opportunity for her own adventures, whatever form they might take. The next morning brought the Queen's announcement, delivered with the kind of formal authority that left no room for misinterpretation. The new protocols established clear lines of authority, mandatory consultation requirements, and specific consequences for anyone who attempted to bypass proper procedures. The media coverage was surprisingly positive, with royal correspondents praising the Queen's modernization of royal household operations and commitment to transparent decision-making. What they didn't report, but what everyone within the royal family understood, was that these weren't just administrative improvements. They were a direct response to a specific pattern of unauthorized behavior. Camilla's response came in the form of a carefully worded statement expressing her full support for Her Majesty's wise initiatives and her commitment to working within established protocols to serve the monarchy's best interests. But those who knew how to read between the lines could detect the barely concealed frustration in the formal language. The real test would come in the weeks and months ahead as the family prepared for Christmas at Sandringham under the new protocols. Charlotte would participate fully in all traditional ceremonies, but more importantly, the precedent would be established that no one could arbitrarily exclude children from family events without proper consultation and clear justification. As William looked out at the October morning from his study window, watching his children play in the garden below, he felt cautiously optimistic for the first time in months. The battle had been difficult and sometimes unpleasant, but they had succeeded in establishing the principle that their children's place in the royal family was not subject to the whims of any individual. Charlotte's laughter echoed across the courtyard as she played with her brothers, a sound that represented everything they had been fighting to protect. She would grow up knowing that her family would stand up for her, that her place in royal traditions was secure, and that fairness and consultation were values that the monarchy genuinely upheld. The Christmas season ahead would be a test of whether these new arrangements would actually work in practice. But for now, William and Catherine could focus on what mattered most, raising their children with the confidence that they were valued and protected members of a family that, despite its complexities, ultimately cared more about love and fairness than about power and manipulation. The phone on William's desk remained mercifully quiet, a small but significant sign that perhaps, finally, the crisis had passed and they could return to the normal challenges of royal life, which, while never simple, were at least predictable and manageable when everyone operated within the same set of rules and principles.